Ив, вы же что-то подобрали?
Болезнь такая.
Спасибо. Привет.
Леня, привет.
Привет. Сколько лет не
Привет. Нет, я-то радуюсь.
Привет.
Привет. Нет, Леня, внимательно.
Да. Почему?
Я тебя защищаю, я тебя защищаю. Я всех хочу, а смотри, если так всех хочу сзади. Ну, согласись. Не дыши на книгу.
Знаешь, я этот магазин помню.
Да.
Пожалуйста,
Не падай.
$51.
Помнишь с нами? Слушай, вот Ренессанс я плохо помню.
Я думаю, первый человек Бродского.
Нет, там был еще Арлекин, помнишь?
Мне нужно спрятать мою авоську с пряником.
Слушай, ну пряник только у меня можно поставить, да.
Можно? Ты только человек, которому можно оставить пряник?
Я буду следить.
Ты неприлично пряники.
Очень со столбцами, по-моему.
Карты в первую очередь.
Слушай, мне 14.
Миша, здравствуйте. Полина, здравствуйте. Люба, добрый вечер. Вы у нас первый раз, я не думаю, что мы с вами
Ну, в такой официальной роли, да. Но тут я приходила, покупала.
Что с ним об этом говорили?
Пока нет.
Да?
А ты
Чего?
что-нибудь сказала?
Это так правильно просто. Это вообще как раз.
Разные. Так, ладно.
Да, располагать, пожалуйста, если нужно по-другому расположить стулья. Подушечку.
Подушечку.
Есть подушечка. Здравствуйте. Присаживайтесь, пожалуйста. Вернее, сначала угощайтесь, потом присаживайтесь. Разговор будет долгим.
Так не
Я не знаю, что. Посмотрим, как обстоятельства.
У нас есть еще записывать или это да?
Да, мы записываем на камеру, и мы записываем, вернее, ведем прямую трансляцию.
Потому что мне сюда до сюда пришел.
Вы будете говорить.
А я там чуть-чуть.
Вы будете.
Да.
Не.
Да,
Все все-таки налили. Что же пить?
да. Какой? Я знаю.
Но мы его уже немножко еще.
И это рыбковод прочитать Люба.
Да.
Хорошо. У тебя записано или нет? Или я запишу.
Нет, мы еще не начали, мы традиционно подождем.
Потом бродящие музыканты.
Потом вроде не слышно что-то. Потом вроде не искушение.
Здравствуйте. Well, we traditionally will wait for another 10 minutes. We have to let people gather around a little bit more. Please supply yourself up with waters, with beverages, snacks. This is going to be a long conversation. And it's a pretty warm night. So please feel comfortable.
Прогулку, знаете, сделать в каком-нибудь порядке?
Это уже потом. Это следующий.
I'd like to buy the book in case I leave early.
Absolutely. What kind of book?
Я думаю, что
The one we're going to
после
talk
первого
about.
раунда беседы вот эти не, ну подожди, первые два, они хотят покушать. Бродящие музыканты ревновали.
Да нет,
За них, да, хорошо. Хорошо. Дальше исключение. Стихи мои. Маша? Ты каждый раз как меняешься, извиняюсь. Ой, да, я теперь... Давно не видела.
Ты очень выглядишь по-французски.
Я думаю, ну точно надо по-английски говорить. Нет, мы должны что-то.
и вообще программа.
Слушай, прогулка очень хорошая. И хорошая. Отвечать за кушание.
Да, просто нужно его поменять. После искусственной прогулки, потому что она тоже количество.
Вот, давай так, я прочитаю в количестве. Люба читает искусство и прогулки. Ну да, они будут.
Это знаете, сделать.
Знаки зодиака. Хорошо. А если будет какое-то
Да.
желание, тогда будем искушать. Теперь сначала либо.
Здравствуйте, Леонид. Выбирайте любое место.
А я вот уже выбрал. Жду,
О.
когда все сядут.
Отлично.
Мы потеряли.
Есть место.
Вы маму потеряли, может?
Вот ваша мама.
Мама есть.
Я всех не
Я хотела еще что-то новое. Есть даже...
Уже когда в университете место бродячих искусств.
Это короче. Давайте вместо брать программы. Да. Окей, отлично. Хорошо. Ну, рыбалка не из первого. Они из первого.
Это вообще, это все,
Нет, бродячие.
это все ребята.
Да, я знаю. Хорошо. Поэтому поговорить не слишком много.
Просто интересно.
Все хотелось. Нет, на самом деле все хотелось. Очень интересно, как они меняются. Нет, все в планах, не все перед ним. Все вообще. Еще не хотелось останавливаться.
Я спрашиваю, еще не хотела.
Ну там, кажется, есть две. Там много. Пожалуй, будем начинать. Я думаю, большинство людей в сборе. All right. Good evening and welcome to the Globus Books. I'm so very happy to see everyone here tonight. I said it before, but I'll repeat it again and again. Thank you so much for your support. It means a lot for a tiny bookstore like us. Thank you for being awesome. Couple quick announcements before we begin. First of all, let's make sure our phones were silenced. Thank you. Okay. Well, there is an online streaming happening right now on our YouTube channel, Globus Books. Please hit the like button, leave a comment, and most importantly, share with your friends. This is how we help other people to learn about our amazing events and incredible talent that we discover and discuss. Here, what's happening?
Destroy everything in one playful movement.
You know what? If you do this one's in this already, it's okay. All right. Yeah. If there are any questions about the store book ordering, purchases, etc., please address your questions to me. My name is Anna, and I'm here to help you with whatever I can. And finally, we're going to have an informal tea party at the end of the conversation. We're going to combine it with the book signing so everybody can mingle and socialize. Well, now, me personally, I've been in anticipation of this event ever since late fall of last year, when a new book of our loyal friend and supporter, Dmitri Manin, came to this world. And this is a book of Nikolai Zabolotsky's early poetry called Columns. And not only their author is incredible, so is the translator. And I'm beyond excited tonight to hear the authentic Dmitri's translations firsthand, learn about his process and all the obstacles he might overcame while he was working on this book. Dmitri is not alone today. He brought a couple of his friends and our friends, of course, our very own Berkeley professors and writers. Please welcome Luba Golburt and Polina Barskova. Polina and Luba. Polina and Luba are here tonight to give us a little bit more insight on avant-garde poetry, on the Oberiuts poetry group, and in particular of Nikolai Zabolotsky as one of the founding father of this literary movement. Well, tonight is all about Dmitri's first solo book of poetry translations in English, and I think it would be fair if Dmitri will begin with some introduction, and then Luba, Polina, and all of us can join this conversation. Thank you. Please welcome.
Thank you. So happy to be here again. It will be a very short, very brief introduction. I'm extremely happy that Polina and Luba agreed to participate, to do the talking, and also read the original Russian poems. I couldn't be more happy than sitting anywhere and listening to them. We'll try to do this as an informal conversation. We will be challenging each other, and please feel free to challenge us whenever you like, right?
Okay, let's challenge each other. Good evening. So we tried to plan this conversation and this reading to the best of our abilities. We'll see how it goes. The task of the evening is rather celebratory. I think I absolutely embrace what Anastasia said. The book is born, and it's a book of that particular kind that basically produces awe, AWE. It's an attempt to bring
That's all.
Into a new language, into a new cultural standard, something that occupies an important and miraculous and difficult place in the world of the Russian language. And the temptation is great, the joy is significant. Let's try to understand what's possible, what's impossible, what this book might mean, what the birth of this book might mean. So Nikolai Zabolotsky, basically, this is whom we're celebrating today, and we're celebrating also Mitya, who dared to be one, I would say Haron, but it's the opposite, right? It's somebody who brings to the world of living in the English language. So we decided that the first movement of this choreography, I will try to formulate as briefly as possible. Why Zabolotsky? Why in this moment of the 21st century? Who is he? Who was he? Why we are still so much looking at him? Why we're sitting here in July in San Francisco thinking about Zabolotsky? So I really sketch things on paper, but I changed so many times in my head this attempt to introduce him. Maybe like this. So when we say a great poet, what do we mean? I think we all have our individual formulations, but one of the most popular one is the poet who manages to create her language, but moreover, who in the duration of their life manages to change several languages. It's a figure of change. And Zabolotsky is that. Zabolotsky, if we look at his any collected volume, we feel that he changed drastically, almost impossibly, from his first attempts to his last years, and at the same time there is certain continuity. And I think this is very significant. He is the poet of the Soviet century, which immediately implies kinds of politeia, tragic politeia that we are so acutely rereading now. All kinds of political choices, or maybe some choices were not his. So, Stolpцы, the book that gathered us here today, is his first book, is his first triumph, and his first scandal. For our meeting tonight, I reread some critical responses to this book, and there is such raw feeling, which is very difficult to experience when you look retrospectively. When you read what people say about meeting this book precisely then in Leningrad, the roaring years of MAP, new economical policy, and all of these poets saying that, like this fireworks event that Stolpцы happened, something new happened in language. A book emerged that spoke to that very moment of cultural life, of political life, of the life of language. That book that was able to represent that extremely controversial and crazy and endlessly productive time and epoch, Leningrad at the end of the 1920s, that was almost obnoxiously, obscenely culturally rich. And that was actually, while it was celebrated and felt so acutely, it was already coming to its end, as it happens often. Because a couple of years later, these people will be arrested, people will be silenced, or these people will choose very different ways to be in culture, for example. So Jan Zabolotsky and his friends, as we say very often, and this is a dangerous word, but nevertheless precious relationship, and also difficult relationship. Zabolotsky and his friends в широких шляпах, в длинных пиджаках. Also, Zabolotsky will be the person to write elegy, the farewell poem for this group is a very wrong word. I don't know. There must be some all these crazy words for animals, pride of some like school of fish and all that. So let's come up with some word for poets. So Zabolotsky and yes, Harms and yes, Vedensky and Oleynikov and at certain point Vaginov, the most remarkable figures of the cultural moments who were able to be in conversation, whatever conversation might mean, including literally. They spent a certain time in the beer gardens of Leningrad, talking to each other or performing this conversation. It's remarkable that one of the two philosophers among them, Leonid Lipavsky, wrote down these conversations. And they spoke these conversations, God knows, they irritated each other, they comforted each other. These conversations fed their poetry, their poetries, but also their task was to remain close and separate at the same time. Because when even I pronounce these names, we immediately think how different these people, these writing people, were from each other. And Zabolotsky, there is a suspicion that Zabolotsky actually was the main hand who wrote the manifesto of Oberiuts group. There is no final evidence or witness, but it seems that Zabolotsky, who was an extreme, regular person, always obsessed with the rules and things like this. He wanted everything to be very official. And later, while this pseudo group existed, he was very big about writing down things about their existence. So, as a part of Oberiuts, but also as a very singular voice, immediately attracted lots of attention of people who really appreciated this book, but also attention that to some extent became fatal. As I understand, I am absolutely not a musicologist, but I'm a culturologist to some extent. Consequence of Stolpцы for Zabolotsky were not unlike consequence of his first opera for Shostakovich, Lady Macbeth Mcenskого Uyezda. And Zabolotsky was really, really, really upset about the cultural campaign in the contemporary press. Basically, he was accused of being this mysterious word formalist. 1930s were already arriving with their new critique and their new voices, and Zabolotsky understood that he needs to change something, basically in order to stay afloat. He failed to survive. He failed to become a good Soviet poet. It's a very long, complicated story of his arrest. The suspicion is that Zabolotsky was arrested in the 1930s as a part of the affair that aimed at Nikolai Tikhonov. But this is a joke. This is the rub of the whole situation, that the wheel of the terror worked so erroneously that this whole thing ended in Nikolai Tikhonov becoming the singular celebrated official poet of the Soviet Leningrad, and Zabolotsky went to Magadan and other areas like that for a decade, basically. Also, and this just, I want to pronounce this, I wanted to quote, but you can find this. It's translated, it's republished many, many times. Zabolotsky left a memoir, though I suspect it's a very wrong term, about his experience of torture. And it's a very rare document of this kind. And since some of us, like I, we spent a rather significant time thinking of the last years and months in the lives of people like Harms and Mandelstam, Zabolotsky just wrote down exactly what happened to him. He survives, and he spends, as I said, many years in the camps, and there he manages to become, which again is a strange pathological hagiography of the Soviet century. He becomes one of the Soviet saints of translation. And his work on Slovo Polku Igoreve, first and foremost, basically saves him at some point. We know of several of these stories. There is a famous story of Tatiana Gnedich in her work on Byron, according to the same scenario. So Zabolotsky is lifted from tundra and celebrated basically by Stalin for his work in translation. And he is returned to the life of the Soviet officialdom in literature. And he has, Stalin and God give him 10 more years, where he returns to poetry, not immediately. It's interesting also that at first it took him some time to become able to write again, but then he writes, and this is how we receive what we call Поздний Zabolotsky, a rather controversial thing. Again, controversial, I mean mostly in terms of poetics. How is Поздний Zabolotsky connected or disconnected from the world of Stolpцы or his philosophical poetry of the late 1930s? Question mark. How Поздний Zabolotsky is connected to the world of his translation? Question mark. Whether Поздний Zabolotsky is a Soviet poet. Again, these are all productive questions, I feel, to which we're looking for all kinds of answers. But I like to think about it from the difficult point of view of continuities. According to his conversations to his peers, some things remain the same. He was obsessed with the world of visual arts. And he himself, again, one should never believe a poet, right? This is a given. But he himself said, and I think it's very interesting, that poetry is connected by Krivinosny Sasuda to visual art, and maybe sometimes with music and never with prose, which I think, at least for the world of Zabolotsky, it stands. Also, poet is some of their readings. And very often conversations with Zabolotsky are about his relationship with different texts of poetry. He changed his opinions a lot. It was a touchy topic, but two names, it seems, remained extremely important, and these are Khlebnikov and Tyutchev, that kind of embrace his whole world of writing, which is also something that might be important for us today. And maybe where we can stop this extremely brief kind of saying hi to Zabolotsky is that he remained in relationship with Stolpcy his whole life, which I find to be extremely interesting and rare to some extent. And throughout all his working life as a poet, he continued rewriting these texts. And some of the versions that Mitya chose to translate are versions of his very early poems that he rewrote in his mature years.
Let me challenge you. I actually translated both. I translated the complete
We'll talk more
1921
about this.
and 58.
But there is, again, we don't have many examples in Russian literature or world literature, and it absolutely tells us something about the psychological world of the working poet. It tells us something about цельность of the creative effort. Again, given all this dramatic change of the aesthetic and spiritual landscape. This is biography. Also, everybody who saw him said that he didn't look like a poet.
They said he looked like an accountant. But also when he read Stolpcy, he was still a young man, so he had a very charming. Sorry.
Thank you.
He had a very charming blush on his face, so he looked like a young accountant.
So the next thing that I thought might be important for us to enter is the question, so if poet equals their creation of language, what is the portrait of Zabolotsky's language in very brief way of introduction? What are the most important things to think here?
That was meant as a question to me, and so I'll take this on. And I think where Polina stopped, in fact, with 1958 rewriting and with the kind of impulse on Zabolotsky's part to regularize everything. And another thing I wanted to pick up on is the mention of Tyutchev. You'll see how it all comes together. One of the main oppositions in Tyutchev's work is that between chaos and cosmos. The world is fundamentally chaotic. The poet comes in to discover or construct a kind of cosmic order in the world. And this is very much the project of Zabolotsky, both for his kind of lifelong project of regularizing things, right? He is known for having a very, very good handwriting, which is not usual for, I mean, maybe some poets do, right? Very, very careful handwriting. He would rewrite his poems on very good paper, and he would use red pen for the opening letter of his poems. And he would pay for these books to be bound, right? And this is something, so the version that Mitya translated for us, right, from 1958, you did both, but in this book, it's 1958. This was compiled and finished a week before he died, and this was his last will. This is how I want this to be published. But we can see this, right, this obsession with rewriting, with rethinking his oeuvre and what would remain, as well as the structure of the 1929 book, Stolpcy, and the very notion of columns, right, as this attempt at regularizing, at instilling order in a world that is fundamentally disorder. All right, we'll instill order, and I'll have a sip of water. So this is maybe answer number one. So what kind of a universe are we entering when we will be reading in a minute? Because I think ultimately the best introduction to a poet's language is reading his poems, which is what we're going to do in a tiny bit. But so the big picture is to think about chaos and cosmos, and to think about chaos as something that this book embraces. It revels in this chaos, right? Its imagery seems to be in this kind of chaotic, frenetic relationship, right? There's too much, right? It's oversaturated. And on the other hand, there is a lack of acceptance for this chaos. Right? There is an attempt to move away from this chaos, not to rein it in, but to despise it, to show that it's problematic, that there is a kind of problem in this, and that this chaotic world obscures some higher order. Interestingly, even in the early reception, in the early appreciative reception, among those who understood what this was about, lots of people felt that two worlds coexisted there. Right? One of a kind of petit bourgeois mещанство, right? Of this kind of, you'll see, they eat a lot, they have impure thoughts all the time, right? Objects have impure thoughts about each other, right? Things that should not be eating want to eat, right? So there's a lot of kind of sinful, frenetic energy happening there, right? But through all of that, these appreciative readers felt that there was also another world, right? That there was a kind of two-world situation there. But an even better, one of these very, very good readers, Dmitri Maximov, who then becomes a very important literary scholar, he says that unlike other poets who also have these two worlds, right, the kind of the ideal realm and the real, Zabolotsky also made you feel the presence of some kind of a third world that happens in the encounter of these two, and that makes your head spin. So when you read this book, your head is spinning. So hopefully you feel some of it as we read. Right? Where does this spinning come from, other than from this encounter between the real and the ideal, if we want to use Tuchman kind of philosophy? Right? It comes from the incredible energy of the movement in these poems, particularly in the 1929 collection of 22 poems that are mostly urban in content, right? And where things are just moving very fast. Right? But they're moving, but they're actually not going anywhere. Right? These are still lives, fundamentally naturmorte, right? They're still lives that are in crazy movement at the same time. Right? So that's churning, right? They're churning, and there seems to be energy, but what that energy is producing is unclear, right? This kind of spinning head, right? So pay attention to that. And one of the things I marvel at in Rita's project, which is truly a feat, right, is how one renders this incredible movement. Right? Because Zabolotsky has some very economical ways of doing that. I think in your translator's introduction, you talk about one where there's this instrumental case, right? Творительный падеж, which in Russian can depict the manner in which something is moving, but which in English can only be rendered by comparing one thing to another. In Russian, you can just say, this moves like something else, but you don't do like. You take away the like. You just do it with a case. All right. So it's this incredible melding together.
At some point, I counted that Russian has 2 or 3 times more ways of expressing a simile than English.
Right. Yeah. And
never
English
think-
always has this. It's not seamless for a simile, right? You have to say something like light, right? In
Yeah,
Russian, you can do this seamlessly to the point that you don't know that the simile happened. right?
Yeah.
And in that encounter of two things that are dissimilar but are suggestively similar, right? That's also where I think that third world that Maximov detected appears, right? There's some kind of an energy in the language that you don't quite know how to describe. And another thing that also Polina mentioned that I would like us to pick up on is the visuality, the extreme visuality of Zabolotsky's world and Zabolotsky's work. And we're going to read in just a second, but I want to lead up to this by reading a quote from Zabolotsky himself. Zabolotsky describes himself. I'll read in Russian and then I can attempt a quick translation. So he says, Н. Заболоцкий, so he's talking about himself, Н. Заболоцкий – поэт голых конкретных фигур, придвинутых вплотную к глазам зрителей. So he's a poet of these naked concrete figures that are placed in front of the viewer's eyes. So like this, right? Слушать и читать его следует более глазами и пальцами, нежели ушами. You should listen and read him with your eyes and with your fingers rather than with your ears. So as we read, obviously you're going to be doing it with your ears, but try it. Try doing the fingers and eyes at the same time. Right? Предмет не дробится, но наоборот сколачивается и уплотняется до отказа. Right? So a lot of people compare Zabolotsky to Cubism, where there's a kind of fracturing, right, of an image. But Zabolotsky himself describes himself not as a poet of fracturing, but rather as a poet of great density. So instead of being fractured, the object, in fact, is condensed. And so this is another thing that maybe we should pay attention to. He's very good at describing who he is, in part because he had a literature education. This is a pitch for our department. Сколачивается, уплотняется до отказа, как бы готовый встретить ощупывающую руку зрителя. Right? So the object gets condensed to the extreme, as if it is ready to encounter the viewer's hand. So it's within your reach and it wants to be touched. Grabbed, yes, exactly. Развертывание действия и обстановки играют подсобную роль к этому главному заданию. So action or atmosphere or setting are secondary to this main thing, right? To this condensation of the object. Okay? So this is what you're about to witness, hopefully. This is what made Mitya's project extremely difficult, because how do you condense, especially as a kind of daring non-native speaker who wants to condense it in a language that is second, right? I don't know, maybe it's not your second, or maybe it's third or fourth, or second language, right? But I think it's a success. So let's get straight to the text, and we will read Rybная лавка. We'll read Rybная лавка, which did not appear in the first 1929 scandalous volume. Okay. И вот, забыв людей коварство, so we'll do Russian first, and then... И вот, забыв людей коварство, вступаем мы в иное царство. Тут тело розовой севрюги, прекраснейшей из всех севрюг, висело, вытянувши руки, хвостом прикреплено на крюк. Под ней кита пылала мясом. Угри, подобные колбасам в копченой пышности и лени, дымились, подогнув колени, и среди них, как желтый клык, сиял на блюде царь-балык. О, самодержец пышный брюха, кишечный бог и властелин, руководитель тайны духа и помыслов архитриклин. Хочу тебя, отдайся мне, дай жрать тебя до самой глотки, мой рот трепещет весь в огне. Кишки дрожат, как готентотки, желудок в страсти напряжен. голодный сок струями точит, то вытянется, как дракон, то вновь сожмется, что есть в мочи, слюна, клубясь, во рту бормочет, и сжатой челюсти вдвойне хочу тебя. Отдайся мне. Повсюду гром консервных банок, ревут сиги, вскочив в ушах. Ножи, торчащие из ранок, качаются и дребезжат. Горит садок под водным светом, где за стеклянную стеной плывут лещи, объяты бредом, галлюцинацией, тоской, сомнением, ревностью, тревогой. И смерть над ними, как торгаш, поводит бронзовой острогой. Весы читают «Отче наш». Две гирьки, мирно встав на блюдце, определяют жизни ход. И дверь звенит, и рыбы бьются, и жабры дышат наоборот.
And the fishmongers. Now leave behind the guile of men. We come into a different land. There the body of a rosy sturgeon, the most delightful of them all, arms dangling, blushing like a virgin, hung from the hook along the wall. The flesh of salmon flashed below, sausage like eels laid in a row, with meat tucked in, languid and tender, gave out the fumes of smoky splendor. Amid them, like a yellow dusk, Bolik the Tsar glowed in the dusk. O glorious god of the intestine! O gastric god, one of a kind, the spirit's master, most clandestine! You, architriclinus of mind, I want you. Give yourself to me. How I devoured you in my thoughts. My palate burns incessantly. My guts shiver like Hottentots. My stomach swells with passion, boils exuding streams of hungry nectar. Now dragon-like it tightly coils, now shrinks and sags a feeble splatter. My mouth is filled with spit and sputter, jaws clenched with savage energy. I want you. Give yourself to me. There's tin can rockets everywhere. Whitefish jump roaring in cuvettes, and carving knives tremble in the air, sticking out of meat little cuts. Behind the glass of the aquarium, in the green glow of man-made sea, the dreamy breams float in delirium, hallucinations, and ennui, full of resentment, doubt, and fear. And looming over like a huckster, death shakes at them his brazen spear. The shop scales, says the paternoster, two little weights on a tin platter decide the life's mysterious course. The fishes thresh, doors squeak and chatter, and throbbing gills breathe in reverse. Maybe there are a couple of things to say about translation. There are a couple of places where I couldn't find a solution, good solution. Дай жрать тебя до самой глотки. I don't think there is in English a word similar to жрать, which is both expressive and crude, almost rude. There are kind of high style synonyms to it, like there's gobble, there's consume, all that is not breath.
Yeah. Devour.
Devour is вечности жерлом пожрется. That's
Yeah.
devour. Пожрется это державин. Жрать is not державин. So what do I do? I don't know. I just how I devoured you in my thoughts. Yes, I moved this to the elevated style. I hope I gave back something in other places, as translators usually do. You can borrow in one place and give in another. For example, I think that the spirit's master, most clandestine, sounds very nice, maybe even better than руководитель тайны духа. So there's this bookkeeping of debt and repayment. Another interesting place is слуна, клубясь во рту, бормочет. Well, you could just do something like the saliva mutters in my mouth, right? There's like 5 ways of doing this. But why does it matter? What does it mean? One aspect of this is that Zabolotsky animates everything. All the non-living things are animated with him. So yeah, saliva can mutter, why not? But also it rhymes with точит and что есть мочи, бормочет. But it could be клокочет, or like boils, just simply boils. Why бормочет? Probably because it needs to be animated. And I didn't do it. I just wrote, my mouth is filled with spit and sputter. And I don't know why. I don't know. I could have rhymed with mutter. I don't know why I didn't do it. Maybe I'll revise this at some point.
But it's nice with splatter.
Speed and sputter, yeah. I just like this sound. This is probably all to say that translation is this two-sided thing. There are lots of rational thinking, and then there is just flowing with the flow. There are lucky people, though, who can flow from the beginning to an end. They don't work like that. My best flowing with the flow is that I have 2 like parts in my brain. One is a clockwork thing that keeps spitting out words, and the other one is a mirror that listens and says, no. Oh, that's it. And so it's good when I manage to like 4-6 lines in a day.
So we'll read more, but I wanted to add, and I really like the flow of sputter that is going on. Maybe we can add some things when they come up. So for this poem and for the next poem, I think it would be useful for you to imagine the historical context. And maybe I didn't stress this enough, that indeed 1920s in Leningrad were extremely weird. These people like Zabolotsky, what they experienced is almost phantasmatic change from the realities of war communism of the early 1920s of starvation. And then, as we said, we keep Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, we hold him responsible for this ingenious move that he decides, in order to abort the crisis development, to reintroduce basically private property for some years. And as they write, like over the night, all these things described so vividly in this poem make it back to the shops of the city. The joke being that most of the citizens were not able to buy all this. So the attraction and the erotica, which is so pronounced here, was very much platonic.
Very much what?
Huh?
Was very much what?
Platonic. They were not able to buy this wonderful fish,
But they were able to desire.
to desire it fully.
Yeah, that line that Mitya, by the way, quoted, right, was yeah, жрать, дай жрать тебя до самой глотки. That's incredibly erotic, right? Whose throat are we talking about? Is it the fish? Is it the speaker? The devourer to the throat. Literally, it says, let me devour you to the very throat. Which throat, right? What is this devouring? How is this going to happen, right? So you have to convert this desire to eat into some other desire.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you can't consummate any of these desires anyway.
And yeah, and also Leningrad of the 1920s, it's a very interesting for the laziness to search for another word. Fortunately, I'm not a translator. It's an interesting moment in terms of social mobility. The city becomes refilled. People move from all kinds of provincial towns and villages. Zabolotsky – это мальчик из Уржума. This is why he writes maybe the most poignant, incredible poem of mourning about Kirov in 1934. Kirov being, of course, the мальчик из Уржума. He is a provincial boy, though from a very, very interesting family. He is very well read, and he's an educated creature in every way possible. But he is able to observe this city. First, he is a newcomer to the city, which gives you a very different kind of vision. You notice things differently. Like it's a topos in every possible literature. Newcomer to Paris, newcomer to New York, newcomer to Leningrad and Moscow. But also to give you all this, vivacity of vision, every important event of this epoch of Soviet literature, be it you named your favorite, you feel the gap. Babel, Bulgakov, Platonov, they all are victims in every meaning possible and impossible of these movements, arrivals, right? And when Bulgakov describes endlessly food in Master and Margarita, the unforgettable sosisочки that Voland presents on that morning. So they're sosisочки made of the same kind of observations. This is one thing. Second thing that we didn't mention. Zabolotsky was not a genius of children's literature. but he worked with them. He was an author of Chish and Yosh. And unlike Harms, first and foremost, and Aleynikov maybe the silver prize, I think Vedensky totally sucked as a children's poet, but then there are people who kind of disagree. But they all worked on, we know in which building, absolutely, right? Novou Griboyedova. And they all were saturated with the sound. And I think some of this sound nature of what is happening here is about them spending many day hours writing poetry for children. Хуже или лучше?
I'll pick up on a couple of things very quickly. One is the sound, right? Someone, I forget whose quote this is, but says Zabolotsky is a poet of loud sound, громкий звук, right? So this is why, that's not because I wanted to be too theatrical, but it seems like it needs to be a kind of louder reading, and Nietzsche did this as well. But I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of other contexts in addition to what Polina mentioned, right? So one is this remaking of the Soviet everyday, right? So there's this crazy transition from the Hungry War communism to the new economic policy, but there's also the transition from a kind of capitalism of pre-revolution to this new reality that is being built. And particularly Trotsky calls for a kind of new byt, новый byt, which is the title of one of the poems in this book, but we're not going to read it. We have to leave you something to read by yourselves and to desire. But this is important, right? So this is not just a poem about fishmongers, right? This is not just about going to the fishmongers and wanting to buy fish, right? There is an ideological problem here, right? What do you do with this kind of byt, right? What do you do when you come to the fishmongers? How do you think about it ideologically, right? How do you turn this into a world of ideas? Right? Another context for this is, of course, early Soviet abandonment connected to this everyday life problem of religion. Another critic, again, I don't remember his name, but he says, Zabolotsky is a poet who captures the world when one has just lost faith. So it's not someone who was born without faith. Right? It's not someone who does not know religion, but it's someone who has abandoned it. And so you can see these traces of a religious consciousness everywhere. And it's not just the kind of consumption that is being that elicits a kind of disgust or difficulty. Right? It's also religious thinking that is difficult and in some ways disgusting. And I will remind you of a couple of lines in Russian and English. Весы читают Отче наш. Right? The sharp scale says the Pater Noster. Right? So this is very important. Right? There is a kind of mutual corruption, right, of the real world of these objects, the scale by religion, and of religion, right, of Otche Nash, by the scale, right. So it's as if you've re-invited the money changers into the temple, and thereby corrupted both the temple and money, and you're observing both, and it's frenetic, and it's everywhere, right? It's too close.
And death is a huckster as well.
Yes, exactly. Right. But they're all there, even in their kind of ideal philosophical way as well.
Mm-hmm. So one more poem, which is this crazy urban march, городской марш, as it can be seen. Ивановы. Стоят чиновные деревья, почти влезая в каждый дом. Давно их кончено кочевье, они в решетках под замком. Шумит бульваров теснота, домами плотно заперта. Но вот все двери растворились, повсюду шепот пробежал. На службу вышли Ивановы в своих штанах и башмаках. Пустые гладкие трамваи, им подают свои скамейки. Герои входят, покупают билетов, хрупкие дощечки. Сидят и держат их перед собой, не увлекаясь быстрой ездой. А там, где каменные стены, и рев гудков, и шум колес, стоят волшебные сирены в клубках оранжевых волос. Иные, дуньками одеты, сидеть не могут взаперти, прищелкивая в кастаньеты. Они идут. Куда идти? Кому нести кровавый ротик? У чьей постели бросить ботик и дернуть кнопку на груди? Неужто некуда идти? О, мир, свинцовый идол мой, хлещи широкими волнами, и этих девок упокой на перекрестке вверх ногами. Он спит сегодня, грозный мир, в домах спокойствия и мир. Ужели там найти мне место, где ждет меня моя невеста, где стулья выстроились в ряд, где горка, словно Арарат, имеет вид отменно важный, где стол стоит и трехэтажный, в железных латах самовар шумит домашним генералом. О, мир, свернись одним кварталом, одной разбитой мостовой, одним проплеванным амбаром, одной мышиную норой. Но будь к оружию готов, целует девку Иванов.
Ivanovs. The office dweller trees stand still, pressing against the city blocks. They roam no more. They've lost their will behind the bars, under the locks. The tightness of the boulevards hums between the stifling rows of homes. But now the doors are all thrown open, the rumor runs along the streets. The Ivanovs go to the office, shoes shined and baggy trousers pressed. The sleek and empty streetcars offer the Ivanovs their lacquered seats. The heroes enter, pay the fare, obtain the tickets' flimsy slats, sit down and hold them stiffly to the side, impervious to the thrill of a speedy ride. And where wheels roll and car horns wail, among the brick and stone walls there stand sirens from a fairy tale with their frayed skeins of orange hair. Some of them, dressed matryoshka-like, are bored indoors, loath to lie low. They're on the go. They stride and strike their castanets. But where to go? Where would they carry their blood-red kissable lips? By whose daybed they'd shed a shoe and tug a bow? Isn't there anywhere to go? O world, my leaden idol, crest high with broad waves, lash out and pound the coast, and let these lasses rest here at the crossroads, upside down. Today The wrathful world sleeps tight. In all the homes there's peace and quiet. But is my destiny room where there's a bride and I'm a groom, where chairs are lined up by the wall, a mountain of a cupboard tall as Ararat looms pompously, where on the table puffs a 3-floor samovar in an iron armor, the household's general-in-chief. Curl up my world onto yourself. Shrink to one block with broken pavement, one spit-bespattered barn for life, one dimly lit mouse hole apartment. But plan for war. Do not relax. And Ivanov kisses a lass. And maybe I'll note a couple of minor maybe things here. Remember, the fishmongers ends with gills breathing in reverse, right? And here we have let these lasses rest here at the crossroads upside down. For some reason, if you count, there may be maybe less than 10, but there's a lot of these head over heels, upside down, topsy-turvy, inside out, backwards, things. For some reason, it was a very important trope for Oberiuts. It's not just Zabolotsky, right? Maybe one of you can say something about this. And I think that the ending here, curl up my world onto yourself, shrink to one block with broken pavement, one spit-bespattered barn. Isn't that exactly what Zabolotsky was talking about objects condensing, concentrated into something very solid, heavy, and touching?
So I have a couple of things to say about this. So one is the topsy-turvy thing. And I think to add to that, there's a lot of vertical movement, right? Things kind of flowing down slowly, eyes, right? And things going up. I think that has to maybe, right? There's lots of explanations for all of it, and none of them are satisfying. But maybe it has to do with that conjunction of the real and ideal realms, right? We're always in the two realms at once. But also just the kind of, this is poetry written very much in the presence of a kind of possibility or desire for enlightenment and reason, and it presents the world as irrational and unreasonable, right? And so a kind of in reverse or perverted, right? So I think that's maybe an answer to your first question. And then the second, the lines that you draw attention to are completely mystifying for me, because it's clear, and I think I read somewhere, I think his biographer in Жизнь замечательных людей, right, this series, he thinks that this is one of the very few, if not the only place in the entire book, at least in the 1929 collection of 22 poems, where the lyric I emerges, right? Where all of a sudden it's Zabolotsky's poetic self who's speaking, right? The world rolled in on yourself, right, as a kind of retreat from this other world that is so impossible.
From that point of view, it's also very interesting that in Vagrant Musicians, he completely rewrote the ending. In the 29 version, I forgot what it was, but in the 58 version, it involves the lyrical I, which was not present in the 29 version. And even more interesting that there is clearly this position of the lyrical eye in the future, looking back at his own self back then. And that's a completely unique occurrence in the whole cycle.
In general, the lyric eye in late Zabolotsky is there all the time, right? That's one of the changes that I think Polina was pointing to, right? How this poet in later years feels very different, but the continuities are also there, right? This kind of engagement with the kind of philosophical by world, right, is always there, right? I think what also changes is that incredible condensation, the density, it's no longer as dense, right? Or it's no longer as visibly in your face kind of density, right? It's no longer the image that's right here, right, sitting on your nose, kind of. It's a little more humane in the way it treats the reader. That's late Zabolotsky, right? This is not. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you feel comfortable around this poetry, but it's not. It's not meant to be comfortable poetry. I don't think. I think it's meant to kind of jolt you and be problematic.
Speaking of jolting, also as a way to react to your question about topsy-turvy, and also to give you some more context about this cultural moment, one finds it rather, I don't know, beautiful and confusing that if we had to name one cultural sphere which attracted every poet of the moment, every young poet, and also that would connect these young poets of the 1920s with people in other media, it was circus. There was something that absolutely circus meant for them rhythm of their moment, cultural synthesicity of their moment, and if you wish, flexibility in every way possible, and grotesque, whatever grotesque might mean, because grotesque was, I recently counted that in one small zametka, Tenyanov would use the word grotesque 8 times. And then I thought, okay, who cares about Tenyanov? Tenyanov does what he wants anyway. Then I decided to count in Ginsburg. She uses in her zametka in reaction to Tenyanov's zametka the word grotesque 11 times without actually explicating. So cirque becomes for this decade the ideal art. And it's so interesting for us now to try to understand why. And I think this perverted order of things, some of my favorite, of course, there is a poem about cirque and Stolpcy, yes, but even the city itself turns into circus. Гляди, ни бал, ни маскарад, здесь ночи ходят не впопад. Again, this weird movement, this freak show of the white knights. So this is something, but also, and this is not that obvious. For me, it's one of the most mesmerizing topics when I think about the 1920s. And overall, the topic of interruption and continuity, this generation in Leningrad more than in Moscow, though Moscow also had its share, was obsessed with Gogol. And Ivanovy as a mask, right, this whole Gogolevskaya lichina, for me, this is very Gogolian device. And in general, he is entering a city and this city is wearing masks, and this city is pervaded with posh list. Whatever posh list might be, of course, posh list as playing with the registers, high and low, as we saw in Rybna Lavka, but also, I think, in Ivanova. And I wanted to ask Mitya, how did you feel when, like, we do know that there is a certain problem when we translate things from Russian and anything non-Russian, right? The Russian thing about diminutives and whole rotic botic. How did you feel about this? And again, this is Zabolotsky's erotica, erotica, right?
Because erotic is kind of disgusting.
Disgusting.
Erotic is a small mouth, a diminutive mouth.
So the first tenet of translation is don't translate words. I've seen more than once a beginner translator disassembles a poem into words, translates the words, and tries to assemble something back from them, and amazingly, even sense often falls victim to this procedure, to say nothing of everything else. To me, what I'm trying to translate is voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how to define voice. I pride myself on being a rational person, but this is where my rationality kind of breaks down. I don't know what is it that I'm doing. I'm trying to write something that sounds the same way as I hear when reading the original. So I have to believe, and I do believe, that any human language is as good as anyone else. And whatever can be said, or rather, whatever can be done in one language can be done in some way in any other. There are exceptions that confirm the rule, but that's the rule, right? It's in mathematical logic, it's even a theorem. Any sufficiently expressive, quote unquote, but of course they do define what sufficiently expressive mean. Any sufficiently expressive formal system is equivalent or is as powerful as any other. And we do have reasons to believe that human languages are sufficiently expressive in whatever sense of the world we are interested in. Okay. So, yes, English lacks diminutives. So what? It doesn't mean that you can't, that there are no turns of voice.
Mm-hmm.
There are turns of voice. There are vocal registers that you can use to express that kind of thing. I don't know if I'm fully in command of that, of course. And I'd be hard pressed to point out here's what I'm doing instead of the diminutives. Where would they carry their blood red kissable lips? By whose day bed they'd shed a shoe and tug a bow? I think there is this
Acerbic.
acerbic, right? Acerbic. These diminutives, interestingly, are not used to make it sweet,
Mhm.
rather to make it sour.
But to capture the kind of sweetness of the language that one uses,
Sweet and
with these-
sour, right?
it's the sweetness of the people whose language is not the language of
So
the poet,
maybe that's the
right?
reason I used the word kissable, because when I was using it, I was kind of unsure. Is it? Should I? May I? Is there a reason to? Maybe that's the reason to do that. I didn't realize, but I didn't rationalize.
But I think on a kind of bigger theoretical level, I think your approach is particularly apt for Zabolotsky, right? Because Zabolotsky is not, I mean, he's a master of words, right? But he's not a thinker in terms of words, right? He's a thinker in terms of tone, in this book in particular, right? And as he's writing this book, he tells his friends, right? I'm writing a book, right? I'm not writing individual poems, I'm writing a book, right? So it's a kind of, we have to always, even as we look at words, right? We love words. He loves words. We have to always keep in mind that there's a kind of totality that he wants us to experience, right? And so if little bits of the totality are kind of reshuffled or not rendered properly, I think maybe that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Well, what else can we do?
So could you talk now about this whole enigma of Zabolotsky rewriting his youthful versions and how you dealt with it?
So I was suspicious about writers disavowing their previous work. And I'm very happy about that Zabolotsky didn't. There's another book of poems that is really a book of poems that I translated, not yet published. It is Sabgir's Sonnets and Shorts, which is also unique in Sabgir's case because in that he always worked in books, but once the book was finished, it was finished, it closed. With Sonnets and Shorts, he kept adding new ones for at least something like 20 years, and it grew up. It increased in volume twice. So, but he didn't rewrite. Zabolotsky did, and it's fascinating to see what he did. In many cases, he just adjusted the punctuation, just the capitalization of lines and some of the M dashes versus commas, that kind of stuff. In some cases, he just changed a couple of lines, maybe in a whole poem, and usually, and in a couple of cases, it is a significant rewrite. Maybe the poem shrinks by a factor of 2, but there is a very clear and distinct direction. He dries it up. He makes it more precise. Often he changes rhymes to less romantic and more exact classical rhymes. And generally, he kind of what's the word? Makes it more neat, less disheveled. Both in the places that he changes and the places that he cuts out or maybe replaces 15 lines by 3 lines. And what's interesting is that I could never decide which version I like better. I like both. I like the more youthful, wild, and free-rolling one, and I also like the more mature, precise, and knowing what he's doing version. So there is a project underway. The centennial of Holmes is coming up in 2029, and for publishing reasons, this is not a complete 1958 version. At the last moment, the publisher found that the book comes out too large to be commercially viable, and asked me to either find money or to cut it by like 25%. And as a matter of principle, I cut it, and that made me think what to do about the rest of it that didn't end up in the book. And I decided to find people who can write about Holmes and then lure some publisher with these wonderful, stellar collective of authors into publishing a centennial edition. And we already have a publisher, and the project is underway. One article is already on my hands. So, and 2 of the prospective authors are here with me, and I'm very, very happy about that. So, should we read some more?
Yep. But I think one thing to mention, and this is in preparation for the next one, Искусство, right? Искусство, is to say that, so you've only heard 2 poems, and you're probably wondering, when am I having dinner? So one of these poems was part of the original 1929 collection. Only Ivanove was part of that. The Fishmongers was not in that collection, right? And right now I'm going to read, and then Mitya is going to read his translation of this poem called Art, right? So it's a kind of, you could think of it as a manifesto or a kind of meta-commentary. And that was written in 1930, so that was already after the first volume appeared. And you will see that this is not an urban poem anymore, right? So another thing to say, in addition to the rewriting, is also the radical expansion of what in fact goes into Stolpci. That Stolpci almost, I mean, not every Zabolotsky poem goes into Stolpci, but Stolpci becomes a kind of all-encompassing project that is not only urban but also rural, because in the early 30s, in a very strange relationship with the collectivization that is going on at the same time, he directs his attention to the countryside, and that's also where his attention to the philosophy of nature, right? I mean, he was always interested in this, but in the 30s, he becomes really a major philosophical poet in the nature philosophical school.
Before Luba reads, I want to say something. So recently, a new literary journal was born in Petersburg and run by our friends. Big fans of Nikolai Zabolotsky, some of them big fans of Zabolotsky, and they decided that the first issue of this new journal will be kind of dedicated to Zabolotsky variously. And then they polled poets, asking them to choose one poem by Zabolotsky that everybody else will be talking about in this issue, writing about. And as a result of the poll, Искусство was chosen. And I was very much against it, of course. So this is arguably the poem by Zabolotsky, voted for by the Russian poets of the 21st century.
Oh, that's very interesting. I didn't know. You will see that this is the only, you won't see, but I'll tell you, this is the only poem in Stoltzy and columns that is written in free verse. Everything else is rhymed, and you need to have this quixotic really goal to capture that sound of the poetry. This is free verse in the original as well.
Not the only one.
Somewhere I read that it's not? Okay. Well, one of the very few. Искусство. Дерево растет, напоминая естественную деревянную колонну. От нее расходятся члены, одетые в круглые листья. Собрание таких деревьев образует лес, дубраву. Но определение леса не точно, если указать на одно формальное строение. Толстое тело коровы, поставленное на 4 окончания, увенчанное хромовидной головою и 2 рогами, словно луна в первой четверти, тоже будет непонятно, также будет непостижимо, если забудем о его назначении на карте живущих всего мира. Дом, деревянная постройка, составленная как кладбище деревьев, сложенная как шалаш из трупов, словно беседка из мертвецов. Кому он из смертных понятен, кому из живущих доступен, если забудем человека, кто строил его и рубил. Человек, владыка планеты, государь деревянного леса, император коровьего мяса, Саваоф 2-этажного дома. Он и планетой правит, он и леса вырубает, он и корову зарежет, а вымолвить слово не может. Но я, однообразный человек, взял в рот длинную сияющую дудку, дул, и подчиненные дыханию слова вылетали в мир, становясь предметами. Корова мне кашу варила, дерево сказку читало, а мертвые домики мира прыгали, словно живые.
Probably you're right. At least it's the most free verse.
Как это называется?
Искусство.
Art. A living tree is reminiscent of a natural wooden column. It sprouts outstretched members dressed in circular leaves. A congregation of such trees constitutes a grove, a forest. But the forest definition is lacking if it only indicates the formal structure. A cow's portly body established on 4 extremities, crowned with a calfskin head and 2 horns, like a first quarter moon, will too remain a puzzle, will also be unfathomable if we forget its significance on the map of all that lives in the world. A house, a wooden edifice, constructed as a graveyard of trees, composed like a shelter out of corpses, a gazebo out of dead bodies, which mortal can comprehend it? Who of the living can grasp it if we forget about the man who cut it and built it? Man, the ruler of the planet, the sovereign of the wooden forest, the emperor of the flesh of the cow, Lord Almighty of the 2-story building, he who reigns over the planet, he who cuts the forest, he who slaughters the cow, not a word can he utter. But I, an indistinguishable man, put to my lips an elongated shining reed pipe, and blew, and subject to my breath, words flew out in the world and turned into things. The cow made pottage for me, the tree read me a fairy tale, and the dead huts of the world hopped like they were alive.
As a pendant to this, and then we can talk about the two.
Mhm.
So we'll read one more in this kind of nature philosophical way, and then maybe say a few words, and then maybe we need to ask you about your level of patience and endurance.
And it's also might be good time for you to ask us about our levels of patience and endurance with Zabolotsky and Mitya and Zabolotsky studies.
Well, not even ask us, but just say things, right? In that kind of. So we'll read прогулка. У животных нет названия. Кто им зваться повелел? Равномерное страдание их невидимый удел. Бык, беседуя с природой, удаляется в луга. Над прекрасными глазами светят белые рога. Речка девочкой невзрачной притаилась между трав, то смеется, то рыдает, ноги в землю закопав. Что же плачет, что тоскует, от чего она больна? Вся природа улыбнулась, как высокая тюрьма. Каждый маленький цветочек машет маленькой рукой. Бык седые слезы точит, ходит пышный, чуть живой. А на воздухе пустынном птица легкая кружится. Ради песенки старинной нежным горлышком трудится. Перед ней сияют воды, лес качается велик. И смеется вся природа, умирая каждый миг.
Animals are nameless creatures. Who decreed they bear a name? Toils untold, unnoticed tortures, evenly their lots the same. In a colloquy with nature, a bull withdraws to meadowlands, and above his eyes of beauty, his white horns exalted stand. Feet all buried in the ground, a river hides mid the grass. Now she laughs and now she whimpers, like a homely country lass. Why the weeping? Why the tears? What has gone with her so wrong? All of nature lights up smiling, like a prison tall and strong. Every pretty little flower waves its pretty little arm, and the bull sheds hoary tears, lush and weary and alarmed. And on the deserted air, an easy songbird wheels about, working on an olden air with its gentle tiny throat. Water shines in sunny weather, the forest reaches to the skies, all of nature laughs together, and in every instant dies.
Which year is this poem?
29.
So one thing to notice here, again, there is a philosophical underpinning to this concept of nature. They're beautiful pictures, but nature is not a beautiful place for Zabolotsky. Nature is a scary, violent place, right? This comes in part from his interest in Fyodorov's philosophy. Right? Nature is a place where things die unnecessarily, right? Everything dies. Fyodorov thought that it would be a great idea to in fact resurrect everything, right? To reverse that course of nature. Nature is also a prison, right? It's a prison house. It's a place where in other poems he describes it kind of in a more gruesome detail, right? Where things eat each other, right? Where there's a kind of perpetual violence.
But it also laughs and smiles.
But
right?
it also laughs and smiles, right? And that laughter, right? So it's this great delight, but what in these poems you don't see the violence quite as much, right? But in fact, you might wonder from hearing these, how are they related to the first two that you heard, with that chaos, that disgusting food, that too muchness? But in fact, they're not unrelated, right? There is a kind of chaotic, unruly side of nature, and that in Искусство, right, he sort of tries to rein in or imagines that art can do something about, right? That art can reverse it, that art can wrap it up. Elsewhere, he's not as optimistic. Right?
I always feel that Vedensky's reliance on rhyme, Vedensky, yes, to a lesser degree Zabolotsky, but in Vedensky it is very apparent. He just uses горе, море, печка, свечка, and allows the rhyme, the easiest, simplest rhyme to lead it. I always felt that it's a sympathetic magic that tries to glue the world. The world is broken, and you try to glue it back with the magic of words. There could be other explanations, of course.
To the opening, the question that Luba voiced, how these are connected. For me, connection is rather obvious. That first poems that we read together are so atrocious that the obvious movement is to escape. This is the connection. That the city that Zabolotsky faces is so against human everything that this is the only way where one can hide from that nightmare. But also, since this is also a little bit our distribution in our real surreal life of our conversations with Luba. So Luba,
She's urban, I'm countryside.
no, this is not what I meant. Luba is a philosopher. While I endlessly read and reread memoirs. And at some point, their situation was so desperate, actually later than 1929, but by 1931, when Harms and Vedensky went in their first exile, they were so broke that, and this is what was happening throughout 1930s, that the only way they could spend some time together, they were walking together endlessly. And in my favorite book ever, записные книжки Евгения Шварца, perhaps one of the most important for me moments when Schwartz manages to summarize, to come up with some definitions of what he thinks about Oberiuts. He describes one of these walks. Also, more and more, gradually, these walks were suffused with anxiety, which all turned up to be very, very just. Most of them were arrested and murdered. And that particular description of a walk in Schwartz is dedicated these are walks conversations. Again, this genre of besiedy that I mentioned before. But also what I liked and what Luba brought up, прогулка как тюрьма. Природа как тюрьма. Стихотворение прогулка, а там природа как высокая тюрьма. Which is sublime. What does it actually mean? This Piranesian image. Yes, of course, прироda, which is filled with its own hierarchies, again, Zabolotsky, order, hierarchies of violence, but also historical tensions that begin to touch them up.
You know, I would actually take issue if we want to challenge each other. I would take issue with this escapist thing about nature. This is a very old tradition, of course. One escapes one's troubles to go and then goes and walks in the woods. This is something that the English Romantics discover, and then already by late Romanticism, this is seen as a kind of problematic stance. That in fact, if you go to nature to escape, you can only escape if you are a fundamentally unethical human being, because you don't notice who is laboring, for example, in the fields, right? You don't notice all sorts of things. Pushkin discovers this very early, 1819, Derevnya, right? I'm escaping, so nice out here. And then he sees the slaves, right? The serfs. He sees them, and he can no longer respond to nature in the same way. Okay, this is an aside, but I don't think for human this is an escape. I think nature, in fact, reveals something that is already there in the urban space. But the urban space is very busy. In fact, the fishmongers, it's all about dead things. All these fish are dead, and they're going to be bought to be eaten by someone higher on the food chain, right? A lot of dead stuff. This is a fundamental condition of nature, dead matter. Nature constantly, in Fedorovian scheme, produces dead matter. You do not escape it. In fact, nature, right, it just gives you in its pure form. Right? And then the question becomes, right, Fedorov is not a very pessimistic philosopher, right? In fact, he's the most optimistic one. He thinks we can resurrect everyone who has ever died, right? And so both of those poems that we read are about, the grounds on which we can rediscover this optimism. How can we turn dead matter into live matter, right? So the end of Искусство, right? In Mitya's translation, and the dead huts of the world hopped like they were alive, right? The artist comes in, the dead huts are hopping like they're alive. In Прогулка, which I already lost, where is it?
Just before me.
Yeah, there's like here we go. Прогулка, same thing, right? But more pessimistic. All of nature laughs together and in every instant dies. Right? The last word is death. So, in fact, being outside of the city allows you to see this reality much more starkly, right? Because the city accosts you with all this imagery where you might lose sight, right? Lose track of the fundamental condition of our life, right? Not just human life, but the kind of world life.
Thank
But
you.
that's a philosophy.
Yeah, Polina and Luba, we can watch you forever challenge each other, but I'm pretty sure our audience have some questions and comments maybe. So please feel free to challenge our experts today. Any questions on Zabolotsky?
Можно я по-русски спрошу? Может быть, это очень наивный вопрос. Меня поразило, когда я прочитала «Столбцы», вот я первый раз читала в двуязычном варианте, я до этого их не читала. И когда я их прочитала, меня просто ударила волна, что Заболоцкий был абсолютно в тот период несчастным человеком, который не находит себе места в этой жизни. Я не могу сказать, что какая-то другая поэзия производила на меня такое впечатление, вот прям так вот вслух. Меня это очень удивило, и я не знаю, насколько это так. И хотя я слышу определенные ноты в том, что вы рассказываете, поэтому я просто хотела вот повторить это, задать это как вопрос, насколько это так, или это все-таки просто у меня так сложилось в тот момент, когда я читала.
Я
Все поэты несчастные.
У меня такого не было восприятия раньше, поэтому я так...
Знаете, кто так же, как вы, прочитал это? Зощенко. Зощенко абсолютно так же прочитал. Он пишет в рецензии, что чувство безвыходного тупика, из которого мало кто может выйти. Но он это пишет уже, когда он знает, что Заболоцкий вышел и написал что-то другое. Да? То есть это как бы хвалебное, где он говорит, что ну слава богу, что он смог не видеть это. Да? Нечем, Зощенко пишет, нечем дышать.
что совершенно поразительно, потому что вот еще одно имя, которое мы должны были сегодня сказать. Да? Если именно в связи с тем, что мы называем зощенковским главным изобретением, да, сказовостью, когда ты перемещаешься в аватарчик другого горожанина 20-х годов, становишься им и говоришь им. Вот в каком-то смысле, конечно, столбцы и страстное изучение города 20-х, это очень... И то, что Зощенко это так почувствовал.
Нечем дышать и не на кого автору взглянуть без отвращения.
Можно спросить, да? Скажите, пожалуйста, Ладейников поэма, она не входит в столбцы?
Это позже.
Это отдельно?
Чуть-чуть позже.
Потому что там нашло, так сказать, развитие и отражение всего его восприятия природы. Очень яркое и необыкновенное. Но это было позже.
Это позже. Это все.
Но она развила вот эту тему, правда?
Да. Это
Очень
30-е годы. Там
красиво,
есть поэма
да.
«Деревья», там есть
Да,
поэма «Ладейников».
умирающая, замерзающая река, все так.
И это тоже вокруг торжества земледелия, да?
Да.
Здоровья.
Ольга.
I just have a translation comment and slash question because this reminds me of my recent discovery that one of the untranslatable words is dom, right? In its meanings of home and house, right? These are so different, and the home, as I think today, has a particular meaning, or like, you know, especially, you know, like when we deal with topics of like, right, exile or homelessness or, you know, it's et cetera. And it's like, this is, how do you approach something simple like that?
Frankly, I didn't notice this particular word. Maybe I was wrong not to notice it. But of course, you discover untranslatable words all the time. One of my discoveries with столбцы was the word цыплячий. How do you translate цыплячий?
Or belonging to chicken.
Belonging to a chicken.
Or like chicken like.
Chicken life.
Chickenish.
Chicken
Yeah.
not, chicken not as an adult, chicken not you.
It's a
English-speaking people describe цыплячье as something. It may be having nothing to do with the word цыпленок.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is exactly what Meta said about not translating words.
Yeah. Well, you can.
But
I
yet
mean,
you have to do something.
words are untranslatable. I mean, if you say one word, you're not saying another. So it's by nature.
Пожалуйста,
But we
ваш
can get
вопрос,
around.
да? Да, пожалуйста, давай.
So actually, what I actually did with цыплячий, с цыплячьим знаком на груди, with hatchling sign across his chest. So it works in this context. In another context, it would be different. With Zabolotsky, speaking of untranslatable words, of course, one of the most salient are бабы and девки. Also мужики, to a lesser extent. He was a village boy. To him, бабы were just married women and девки were just unmarried girls. But of course, those words didn't sound the same way for city dwellers of the time, I think, and they sound completely differently for us today, because they acquired all sorts of derogatory meanings and connotations.
Мне кажется, ты очень упрощаешь.
Social class.
Он был сын агронома, это уже не крестьянин, это уже образованный слой. Они смотрели немножко сверху.
Okay, but maybe his speaker is more of a village boy still, at least in the city columns. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's even more complicated than I described. Yeah.
This is how complicated it is. So, девка absolutely in village usage is an unmarried woman, but by the moment when we meet them in Stolpцы, девка is a prostitute. Just, it's a given. In Google,
But not necessarily totally professional. Yes, you can be a professional, but she also doesn't have to be a professional.
No, I don't guess that at least some of the devkas are just young girls viewed by a village boy.
Contemporary American life, it is just a young woman.
Anyway, so what do you do with that?
Young lady.
young lady.
No, definitely not a lady.
So when Bobby are corps de ballet in jazz, I render them as matrons. Because they're
But that makes them very heavy in ballet, right?
oh, but Bobby are kind of heavy, yes. And they're incongruous in ballet. That's the main thing. When they are housewives, that I think I just did housewives. When they are traders at a market, they're tradeswomen, and so on and so forth. And for devki, I more than once I used lasses because I love
Lasses is great.
Yeah.
But also, I need to say this. So in all these conversations written down by Lipovsky, Oberiut folks, to use this language, they're quite different persona. And one of the parts of Zabolotsky's persona was Zabolotsky in Lipovsky's realm of Oberiut was страстный женоненавистник. Misogynist, sorry. There are many charming hues to this. For example, he would insist that женщины ничего не понимают в цветах.
Не могут любить.
Женщины не могут любить цветы. And then,
Women can't love flowers.
So the whole thing of Zabolotsky and writing women in the 1920s is a very rich topic for discussion.
But the problem with those women, Babu and Devki, right? It's an influx of a particular social class, right?
Yep.
It's an influx of rural culture into urban culture, right? It's an influx of a very different class that is now the ruling class, right? So it's that kind of, it's misogyny, but it's also a kind of class consciousness with whatever plus minus, right? But it's
Right.
it's a class conscious poem, and that's very difficult to render.
But of course you don't have to do this all in the same word. You can relegate this to other meanings, right?
Yes.
Speaking of class consciousness, I'm not very familiar with Zabolotsky specifically, and I'm only now just starting to delve into his biography and more deeply. But from what I understand, he had a very twisted, complicated relationship with various thought currents of his rather long age. So I'm wondering, since as I understand it, a kind of a dialectical consciousness is very prominent in his poetry, and in some ways he was very much of a avant-garde in seeing poetry as a vessel of transforming consciousness and having a certain resentment against habits of cognition and against almost a misanthropy against the residual banalities of his contemporaries that were inherited from the old. I can't remember the exact line, but it's often quoted. Yeah, so I'm wondering how he might have viewed, how did his stance in relation to transformation of consciousness and by extension literature and the goal of literature relate to the official and as well as also widespread critical, especially left-wing critics, many of whom perished in 1937, right alongside Oberiuts and some of the young symbolists and everyone else.
To answer your question, would be to write a beautiful, extremely difficult book. So I have to warn you.
We could say something.
But we could say something. I will say something brief to give Luba time to think a little bit, to formulate. For me, one of the most perhaps poignant things about Zabolotsky, and it rhymes fully with the case of Mandelstam, with whom they had mutually awful relationship, is in both cases violent attempt to become Soviet, to put it crudely, which both took as a social challenge but also as intellectual challenge. And the irony is that by the time when Zabolotsky was arrested, he was absolutely ready. He was working desperately to move to. He left Oberiuts. He had very decisive quarrels with Vidensky and Harms. He was remaking himself into a very different kind of voice and social being. So, but he was doing it in Zabolotsky way, right? Kind of through Fedorovian move and things like this. This is something. This is my moving along your lines of his dialectical thinking.
Yeah, but you would say that he was more or less sincere in seeing a necessity for that, rather than just trying to adapt to political pressures and.
Well, this is the accursed question, right? Mm-hmm. How sincere you can be when you understand that this is a question of life and death. I think he was sincere. But also he wanted to do it, to move with the state in his own way, to invent this way, and many things happen.
Yeah.
My answer is exactly like Polina's, but I'll still give it. In fact, so the scandal around his Staupci, right? The first reception, the very first reception, recognizes him as a left-wing poet, right? Recognizes Staupci very early, right? As in line with the revolution, right? As in fact rejecting this petit bourgeois reality. Right? But that changes very quickly because there's such an acute vision there, right? And so much appreciation for this dead fish, for this food, for these fishmongers and salespeople and consumption, right? That it's hard to say whether he hates all of this or loves it, right? And if he loves it, then he is the kind of reflux of some kind of a pre-revolutionary consumerist culture, and he wants it to return, right? Unfortunately, his collection comes out in 1929, which is basically the very tail end of NEP, right? And right after that, we have the great turn, right? The great Великий перелом, right? Where all of that kind of playfulness around the problem of consumption is no longer acceptable, right? Where we get collectivization. He doesn't quite pick up on that right away, right? So he writes more stuff about the agrarian world, and that stuff is no longer accepted at all, right? He thinks that he is writing in line with collectivization, but no one else sees it as in line with collectivization, right? And so that's the shift. I think the shift is the shift that you want us to describe within him is in fact the shift of the world around him, right? Throughout his life, I think he maintains this interest in transformative possibilities, right? And revolutions are also transformative possibilities, right? It's a kind of potential for transformation that he's very interested in, right? But the world it changes, right? The aesthetics that is being asked for is very different.
Well, I think I have sort of a tangential question. I've noticed in the poems that you've read today that poems that are about the city are they have a lot of sort of this mocking tone that we talked about before. But the nature ones are also not exactly celebratory. He's not saying like you said that nature is not all this beautiful butterflies and flowers, right? Nature is things dying.
Tales untold.
Yeah,
and torture.
And the horrible things. But there seems to be none of the mockery of nature. It's a sort of respect for it. Do you think that in those poems he also sees a sort of beauty in that? In the nature, in the sort of cycle of things dying and then being reborn? Unlike in the city, where could it be a sort of thing of humans sort of poorly replicating this cycle of nature? I don't know. I've had 10 minutes to think about that.
Maybe I'll add to your question and redirect it to Mitya, because so you were talking about translating for voice, right? And I think I don't know your name, but I think the voice changes, right? And in these poems, the mocking voice does go away. So what do you do?
Yes and no. The voice is definitely different, right? There's more of a not celebratory, but we're moving from maybe a whorehouse to a temple. Things are also awful there, but it's still a temple.
Sort of respect. Yes.
Respect is a good word, yeah. On the other hand, I read, it's not my fault, I've read it somewhere, that Zabolotsky has no oppositions. Whatever you take, up and down, funny, sad, tragic, comic, alive, animate, inanimate, dead, alive, moving still, upside down and downside up. There's no real difference. It's all inseparable. And so the opposition of which you are talking about, maybe, yeah, it's also there, but it's but still.
I see a different facet of
yeah.
Thank you.
Пожалуйста.
Yes.
Yeah, when you are running this list of upside down things, you may want to mention the inside your body, where the upper parts of the body are switched with lower parts of the body. Like Alexei Nikolaevich, the Tsar, prohibiting street artists because they are срамные удеса в лицах носящие.
Bakhtin is the product of absolutely this moment. A huge fan of these people. When asked at the end of his life who is the best Russian writer of the 20th century, he says that it's Vaginov, who is a buddy of Zabolotsky. And basically, it's very interesting that Bakhtin came to the West a little bit outside of the context. Without his friends, without his cats, it's a real problem. We have to somehow mend this. Yes, he was talking absolutely about this world of events and ideas. And it's great that you noticed it.
Any more
It might be
questions?
time to move to the candy and to the books.
To consumption.
Жрать книги also because it's global.
Right. Well, thank you, and let's move to the next chapter. That's the tea and candy, as Polina said. And please feel free to sign your book with our authors today.
Buying of this beautiful red book. Thank you.
Thank you.